So yeah, it sounds like there's a real range of experience here, which is great. And I think, just being here and as Rhett was saying earlier, just sort of being part of this community, hearing what other people are working on, hearing what other people have to say, it's really the first sort of step to fundraising for a project is hearing from your peers. And a huge part of what I do is research similar projects, who funded those, talk to and look at what else is sort of happening in my community and my sphere, and kind of working off from that. So let's just dive in. Again, if you have questions at any time, feel free to ask. And then at the end, I'm happy to talk more in depth about any specific questions or what I do at MoMA or really anything. Okay, so just a few basics so we're all on the same page. What is a grant? I found it really surprisingly hard to find a good working definition of what a grant was. A lot of the language I came across when I was searching around for it had, phrases like non-refundable or, a loan that does not have to be repaid. That's definitely not true. So I kind of have this awkward Frankenstein definition that I put together. But a donation from an organization to an individual or group that is usually the result of a request. And I say usually because there are times when, probably the biggest, flashiest, most famous example is the MacArthur Genius Grants, but there are such things as grants that are sort of surprise grants, where community leaders will, designate funds to projects that they think are worthy. So there's not always even an application involved, but of course, most of the grants that you'll be thinking about and talking about and we'll be discussing today will have some kind of call for proposals. A proposal is sent in, a board will review those proposals, and then money will be granted with some kind of restriction or requirements related to those funds. So speaking of restrictions, sort of two general groups of grants that you can apply for would be restricted and unrestricted. So restricted means, it's really could be a whole range of things, but maybe it's a grant that's supposed to be just used for hard costs like equipment or capital costs of some sort, or maybe it's just to pay actors, or maybe it's whatever it is. And then unrestricted could just be to the project in general. It could just be to you in general. So for MoMA, unrestricted grants that we get are usually just go to general operating costs and just to our general bottom line. But so those terms will come up a lot when you're looking for grants. Kinds of grants as well, cash, non-cash, and in-kind. Good to understand what the difference between those are. Cash is usually, just what it sounds like, just any kind of check, cash grant that could be spent down. Non-cash would be something like assets that could be transferred, securities, stocks, bonds, annuities, those kinds of things. Probably less of what you're going to be looking at as individuals. And then in-kind are any donated services or goods. So the film shop's doing an event, they talk to Brooklyn Brewery donates 5 cases of beer or whatever it is. That would be an in-kind gift. But you'll also see a lot of in-kind gifts for technology or equipment, things like that. Space could be another in-kind donation. So types of grant-making organizations, again, these are terms that you'll see over and over again when you're looking for different opportunities. Independent grant-making organizations are any organizations that have a board that is not connected to the original source of funding. So it's different from, for example, a community or family foundation. Family foundation would, it's the family's assets that they're distributing. Community foundation, often a group of smaller funds that are somehow related to a purpose within a community. And of course, corporate, it may be different from, a matching gift program by a company, but some kind of entity within a company, affiliated with a company that is sort of put in place to advance their goals or philosophies, or sort of philanthropic arm. Okay, isn't crowdfunding easier? So I'm sure off the bat, all of you are like, these are a lot of terms. Hi, welcome. And it seems like it's really hard to find a grant, to write a grant. It's a long process. This application looks like it's going to be taking a lot of time. Wouldn't it be easier to just set up a Kickstarter? And the answer is, yeah, it probably is. But I would definitely encourage you guys to sort of think micro and macro about your project when you're in this stage of figuring out how you're going to be putting together funding. So consider your project budget. As we heard, some of you have raised money for smaller projects or smaller grants. If you're looking at a project that's just a couple of $1,000s, that may be very easy to do with crowdsourcing or crowdfunding. But if you're looking at a budget that's maybe over $10,000, or maybe you're not sure, what the different phases of it will be, it may be a lot more challenging to kind of put that out there in a crowdfunding platform. And think about the big picture too. So there are a lot of benefits to getting a grant. You'll gain a lot of exposure, even if the grant isn't necessarily successfully funded. You're presenting your project and essentially your business plan to an organization that is in that field and in that community. It could foster different kinds of partnerships, whether with the individuals or affiliated with that other organization on the board. Again, it's just sort of putting your project out there in a different way within your own community. You could have more opportunities for sustained support. So if you fundraise through Kickstarter or through some kind of crowdsourced platform, it's great. Maybe you'll get $5,000 up front, but if you get a grant, you might have an opportunity to renew funding. You might have an opportunity to get a certain amount of money over, say, 2 years. That's a tactic we use a lot in MoMA to say, okay, we have a project, it's a 5-year project, maybe we can go to this foundation and say, okay, instead of getting $100,000 up front, what do you say that we try to get $25,000 for over the next 4 years? So it could be a way to engage someone in a different kind of way for sustained support over the life of your project. And then lastly, of course, there is an element of prestige to sort of partnering with an organization that has funded other prestigious, successful projects, and just it lends sort of a different, opportunity on both sides for crediting for your film or project. So how do I find a grant? So just to be totally upfront, as I said before, and as you could probably hear from my introduction, I'm not a filmmaker. So I have never before gone out as an individual filmmaker to find funding for a project. But that being said, really my tactics should be the same as your tactics, and I search for funding for projects every single day. So the first sort of obvious spot you should look, but perhaps not so obvious in a certain sense, is really to mine any filmmaker resources in the field. And I do this on behalf of MoMA every day. I am on a million listservs. I subscribe to every publication, periodical. I have about 1 million Google alerts set up for all different kinds of projects, foundation grant, museum grant opportunity, just everything. I fundraise specifically for certain areas of the museum, a lot of conservation, film preservation, library and archives, performance. So any sort of subfield that I'm looking for, I will spend a lot of time doing internet research, signing up for different resources available to that sort of subfield. So Foundation Center, who here has heard of Foundation Center or has used it before? Okay, so a couple people. I really can't say enough about how this is sort of the lead resource in the field of working with grants. The address is foundationcenter.org, and if we have time at the end, I'm happy to do kind of a live demo of how it works with you all. It is behind a paywall for a lot of the search engines, but I think the rates for individuals can be pretty reasonable, but best of all, if you actually go to their library, which is right by Union Square, everything is free. So if you ever go to their library, you can use all their resources for free. They have librarians there. They have really amazing resources that are like very specific. So if you go in there and say, hey, I'm an individual looking for funding, I'm a filmmaker, these are the kinds of projects I'm trying to fundraise for. It's a documentary, it's a creative project, it's a fiction project. They will help you kind of narrow down your choices of what's available to you. So I use Foundation Center, again, as an individual fundraising for an organization every single day. And I have a screenshot of some of the fields in my next slide, so I'll show you guys that. But really, it's just about kind of doing your homework and being creative. I was thinking about different examples when I was putting together this slide, and the head of MoMA's library the other day sent me an invitation to a talk, I guess, that he was invited to. And at the very bottom of the invitation, it was like, this talk is sponsored by XYZ Foundation. And he sent me the invitation, and he was like, hey, have you ever heard of this foundation? They're sponsoring this talk. They're not affiliated with MoMA. We don't know them. Let's do some research. And so that led to me figuring out that one of the board members of that foundation who was sponsoring this event had just joined our library council, and so kind of put the wheels in motion for a future conversation about how to get funding from that organization. So I think there are a lot of different ways you can consider your project. Maybe the subject of your documentary or project aligns with a foundation that, maybe you're doing a documentary about, penguins, and there's a foundation that supports research related to Antarctica, and maybe they've never funded a documentary before, but maybe it's worth picking up the phone and calling them and seeing if they'd be interested. We use that tactic all the time at MoMA. We're funding some kind of performance, and there is a foundation that funds German dance projects, and they've never funded anything in a museum before, but the choreographer is German, and we're doing it in our atrium, and would they be interested in kind of having that conversation with us about what our project is? And they might say no, but the worst thing that could happen is they say no, and then maybe you invite them anyway, and then maybe they say, hey, this is great, we wish we were involved, and maybe next time we will be. So think, consider foundations that don't traditionally support film. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a dead end. And consider your background. There's a lot of alumni awards out there, different professional organizations that offer grants to individuals. And again, a tactic that I use all the time is who funded similar projects, period. So, look at what else is out there, maybe documentaries of the same length, the same subject, creative projects that, got a lot of press in the past couple of years. Who funded those projects? How did, they did it somehow. How are, if you're doing something similar, it's a great place to start. And then once you have the resources of, say, Foundation Center, you're able to see, okay, Foundation X funded these 3 projects that are kind of similar to mine. They're not accepting proposals right now, but now that I have Foundation Center, I can see who's on the board and draw some connections there too. Oh, this person is on the board of this foundation. I have some kind of connection to them. Maybe I can approach them as an individual. So I think it's all about kind of being creative, following all kinds of leads. And again, I think, the worst thing that could happen is people could say, thanks, but no thanks. And again, we can kind of poke around a little bit after I go through the presentation if anyone's interested. But this is kind of just a basic screenshot from what it looks like when you go to foundationcenter.org, click on Foundation Directory Online, which is one of their databases. This is the Search Grant Makers tab. So you can put in, of course, if you're looking at a specific foundation and you want to know more about them, to kind of drill down to see who's on their board, what exactly are they funding, what kinds of grants and what amounts. You can just look up a specific foundation. But then you can also, if you don't know what foundation you're looking for yet, you can put in fields of interest, you can put in film, you can put in penguins, you can put in any kind of, if you're looking for a certain type of support, okay, well, we're really fully funded, but what we really need is, space to produce this in. You could search by types of support, geographic focus, maybe your project is focused on a certain community, or conversely, maybe, the project was created and put together all in Brooklyn, and maybe there's a foundation that would support something like that. So it's just about looking at your project from as many different viewpoints as possible, and kind of mining through, and kind of sorting through and sifting through any leads that could come up. So I think a question that's really rarely asked but should be really thoughtfully considered is, should I apply? And I mean, kind of my number one thing when it comes to this stage, when you're like, all right, I have a short list of prospects, figuring out, what my next steps are, I think you should always sort of pause and ask yourself this question. Okay. And sort of my number one thing that we say all the time in my office is, don't be afraid to ask questions. If you have some way of getting in touch with these foundations and either funders or organizations, and you have the ability to reach out to them, to contact them, it just never hurts to pick up the phone, give them a call, say, hey, I came across your name when I was doing some research for my project. It seems like my project might be a great fit for the kinds of partnerships that you all pursue. Here's a little bit about it. And I mean, it's just the best way to get feedback, because they could say, hey, we are really interested in your project, but you know what, our docket is already filled for this fall, but you know what, if you apply in the spring, we'll put you on the top of the pile. Great. Or they could say, you know what, no, we're not interested, thank you so much, and then you've just saved yourself a lot of work. So I think it could, it just never hurts to pick up the phone, contact a foundation. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And that kind of goes through as you're applying, as you're receiving feedback. The best case scenario is they say, great, this sounds like a great fit for us, and then they're expecting it, they already have a heads up about it, maybe they know a little bit about what your budget's going to be already, and you can just have an honest conversation with them. They can often, just provide great feedback. So other things to consider. All right. So other things to consider when you're thinking about applying for a grant that's sort of made your short list. Consider your budget. I mean, everything starts with your budget. So your budget is $100,000, and this is a foundation that only makes grants of up to $1,000, and it's a really competitive application. Maybe it's not worth your time. Think about your timeline. The timeline of your project is super important for applying to grants, because the average grant is about a 6 to 9 month turnaround. I mean, for a smaller organization, it could be less than that. For a larger organization, it could be more than that, believe it or not. But if you're hoping to premiere your film in the next few months and the notification date isn't until next summer, I mean, it may not, again, be a great fit for you. Consider the application process. Is this going to be, a letter, or is it going to be a, 50-page application with every attachment imaginable, many of which you'll have to create from scratch? Often when I'm going through an application, going through this process, I'll highlight anything that I don't already have on hand. And if there's a ton of highlights at the end of the application where it's just going to be a tremendous amount of work to kind of generate new materials for a grant that maybe is only going to fund potentially a very small percentage of my project budget, again, maybe, it's not going to be our highest priority. Recent grantees, again, you'll find a lot of this from Foundation Center or just, from searching online, but okay, this foundation seems like a great fit. Who else have they given money to recently? What's the average award size been? Maybe if they're, giving much larger grants to much larger projects, maybe your project isn't a good fit, and vice versa, of course. And also from Foundation Center, you can figure out what's their annual giving and what are their assets. So if it's a small organization or foundation, maybe they're only giving, $5,000 or $10,000 in grants per year, and if you have a $50,000 hole in your budget, maybe, again, these are all things that can help you kind of decide whether or not to take that next step.
Isn't it better to say like 5,000, 10,000, whatever it is, if, it doesn't 5,000 is a 5,000 in a film budget.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think you just have to do that cost-benefit analysis a little bit. If it's a huge application and it's going to be, a tremendous strain on your time, and it's only going to be a small percentage of the budget, it could be a consideration for you to, maybe your time is better spent on another grant application that's for a larger percentage of the budget. Although that's a bit of the MoMA in me speaking, because when I worked for smaller organizations, it was way more scrappy and like, hey, we're going to get any money we can. And I think, part of working in a bigger organization now is you just have to be more strategic, because you can't apply for everything, and because a lot of the budgets are so big. But I think it still should be a consideration. If it's a very small grant and it's a huge application, I mean, maybe your time is better spent elsewhere. Though I will say that even if it's a small application but it involves a lot of components, if you can recycle those components for other applications or other parts of your project, whenever I have a curator who's grumpy with me because we have to put together some giant proposal like a year and a half in advance of the opening of the show, or 2 years or more, and they're sort of have to generate a lot of these materials for the first time for this application, I always remind them that once we have all of these materials put together, it's going to benefit everyone. It's going to benefit me, because I'm going to be able to go out and fundraise so much more effectively for this exhibition or project, because we have all of this stuff so far in advance. And for them, it's going to help them think through certain aspects of the project, which is often a sort of necessary evil. Okay, so, those of you who have written grants in the room before know that grants proposals are often sort of like miniature business plans. They, describe the who, what, where, when, and how much, as we like to say. And each proposal really has to convincingly answer those questions, so that a funder can look at your proposal over all of the other ones that they have received and really understand all of the reasoning behind your project. And see it outlined in a very clear way. So always start with the budget. If you leave with one thing from this workshop, always start with the budget. I mean, if you don't have a budget, you don't have a project. If you don't have a budget, you don't have a grant proposal. You can't write a grant. That is my absolute number one mantra. If someone comes to me with a project, and my first question 100% of the time is, great, so what's the budget? And if they say, I don't really know, no, you're not at the stage where you're ready to apply for a grant. You need to know the budget. Every aspect of your grant proposal will feed back to your budget, and vice versa. So the narrative portion and the budget will speak to one another. And it has to be one cohesive document. You're asking for money. That's why you're writing this grant proposal. And you can't be squeamish about it and shy about it. You have to know what the budget is. You have to know about how much you're asking. And again, some of that research that you've done prior to this point will help you determine what's an appropriate ask related to the size of your budget. So another term that we use a lot is accordion proposal, which I think is a really good way to think about a grant. So you need to be able to talk about your project. You need to have your whole project down to your elevator pitch, your 1 or 2 sentences, and then you need to be able to write a summary paragraph about, that encompasses what your project is, and then potentially, some of the grants I write are 50 or 100 pages long into the narrative and all of the very minutiae details. So you need to think about grant writing too as sort of having that accordion proposal, as my former boss would say. What's your project in 1 sentence? What's your project look like in 1 page of a description? And what does it look like beyond that? So whether it's, a 1-page project summary or a much larger application, you need to have that ability to stretch as needed. So again, you're going to have a set of requirements for any grant you apply for. They'll be stated, on that organization's website or in the call for a proposal. And again, it sounds silly, but of course you want to follow those requirements. And again, don't be afraid to ask questions. If there's a number to call, if there's an email address, don't be afraid to reach out and say, hey, you say you want your budget in this template. I have a question about, what budget lines X, Y, and Z are. Or, you say that you require this certain attachment. We've kind of done it this other way. Is this okay, or do I have to redo it? Don't be afraid to have that conversation with the funder. And again, if they know that your project is coming and that your proposal is coming in the door, all the better. So the basic components of a grant, which again, those of you who have written one should be pretty familiar with. Often there's a cover letter with kind of a master summary. So again, that accordion proposal, that 1 or 2 sentences about what the project is and why it should be considered for funding. Then there's often a proposal narrative of some kind. It could be a paragraph, it could be 10 pages long. It really just depends on what those requirements are. Often there's a timeline, and the timeline could be a part of the narrative. The timeline could be requested separately as a true timeline of this is how this project is going to be coming together. And of course, there's going to be a budget, which is going to, you start with the budget, you end with the budget, everything kind of feeds into that budget. And any attachments, and attachments that are commonly requested are often your CV, resumes of people you're working with, any kind of documents that show those qualifications. It could be some kind of work sample or sample from your project. Other examples. Sometimes they, any kind of like specs you have with film proposals I've written, they might want to know, what technology you're using, the length of the film, those kinds of different specifications. Okay, so I am, with apologies to MoMA, I'm going to throw up a couple of different pages sort of ripped from various proposals I've worked on, just to give you guys a sense of kind of how these building blocks can come together. And again, what you do may look very different from what this is, but really the components are the same, the strategy is the same. So I've thrown up a cover letter. This is like sort of a very basic boilerplate, our director doesn't know this guy doesn't really know us, kind of a cold proposal cover letter. And you can see that we just kind of have a couple of sentences about what this project is. This particular proposal was to the Hollywood Foreign Press Association's foundation, asking them for funding. I thought I'd make it film themed, so it's asking them for funding for MoMA's film preservation activities. And MoMA actually has a film preservation center that's out in Hamlin, Pennsylvania, which is pretty cool. And so it's this whole proposal was about kind of what the Hamlin Center is and why it's out in the middle of nowhere because of all the nitrate film, and kind of what our preservation activities are, asking for, in this case, renewed support for this project. So you can see I have a sentence or two. You just lead the first sentence, put it all out there. So Museum of Modern Art, pleased to submit this application seeking support for MoMA's Les Barges Film Preservation Center in Hamlin, Pennsylvania, an important guardian of cinematic history, blah, blah, blah. Again, you want to put the ask amount like as close to the beginning as possible. Just lay it all out there. So who you are, what you want, what the project is. I hope the Hollywood Foreign Press Association will join us again this year with a generous gift of $20,000 to sustain film preservation activities, and then give the timeline. And then I just have, please find the following materials enclosed for your review. They ask for certain, they ask for 2 copies of certain things. So grant application form, proposal narrative. This is sort of the most standard application, which is why I chose it to put up here today. So there's an application form, proposal narrative. They ask for 2 copies of each. A project budget, of course. They ask for MoMA's audited financial statements, different IRS filings, list of board of trustees. So, again, these are sort of standard attachments for an organization applying. As an individual, you might get asked for different things. And then again, your contact information, make it as easy as possible. So, you can contact Glenn Lowry, if you would be so bold. His contact information is on the bottom of the page, or you can contact me. And short, sweet, to the point, very straightforward. This is going to be kind of blurry because it was like a crappy screenshot, but they asked for this grant application form. You can see it's just like boilerplate information, filled it out, just kind of very simple info that they wanted as kind of a cover sheet. Then we have the actual, and you can see that there's a header. I'm just pointing that out because you want to make this as easy as possible. If they were to drop your application on the floor and it's lying there in a pile of paper, you want them to be able to say, okay, great, let me put this back together. I know exactly it's page 1, 2, and 3, and here's the header. And if the application gets split up and for some reason one board member is looking at cover letters and one board member is looking at budgets, you want them to be able to just look at any single page of your application and know who it's from, how much, what's for, what page it is, much like any application that you would do, really. So again, there's a header. They ask for a 1 or 2 sentence request statement. Again, just that sort of basic information. The grant ask amount is in the very first sentence again. And then they asked for a project description, which I think in this case was to be like several paragraphs long. This is the second page. They asked for an organization description. And they ask in this case specifically about how they'd be acknowledged or credited. And again, part of a partnership with an organization is having it benefit both of you. So they're giving you a grant, how are you going to credit them? What are they going to get out of it? And, for a smaller foundation, community foundation, family foundation, that may be less of a concern. For a corporate foundation, that is their only concern for the most part. So, again, this is, we just say here they'll be listed in our annual donor listing. If this was a corporation, this proposal would look very different. First of all, just coming from MoMA, but we would have way more about sort of what they would get out of this collaboration. And it's just good to keep in mind, who your funder is. The letter you write to an individual funder may be a different letter than the one that you write to a corporation asking for funding. You want to think about, what do they want to get out of it as well. Project budget narrative. And then this was the budget that I sent. It's actually kind of different from a lot of the budgets I send, but they wanted it in this very specific format. And in this case, they asked for our fiscal year 14 budget and then our fiscal year 13 actuals, so they could compare. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of a step back now again. Any questions at this point?
That's a grant that Museum of Modern Arts will
Yes.
to who on this?
To the Hollywood Foreign Press Association.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
In terms of a budget like that, and it's obviously different from the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, but are they interested in how you're grant writing to other organizations as well? Like, for example, where does your 20,000 fit in terms of your overall income?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot from funders, and that's often on grant applications. That's a great question. So again, in this case, they literally were like, these are the lines that we want to see, and like this is sort of, and that could happen. Sometimes I smush together budget lines if they want a very basic snapshot budget. Sometimes they ask you to break out specific things, but they often will ask, so this is just expenses for the most part, but often they'll ask for expenses and income. So exactly, so in that case I would have expenses, my budget for the project, income, and then, okay, I'm getting $5,000 from this source, $10,000 from this source, $1,000 of my own money, and then I would put in italics the ask amount that I'm asking from the organization. And then that total income should be the same as the total for your budget. There's actually a budgeting session later this afternoon, right, for a film shop.
Yes.
So I didn't want to go too much into budget here because I know that it's going to be covered with a full session this afternoon.
In the case of MoMA, how speculative can that income description be? Because, you know, like, for example, you're saying, I'm gonna get a grant from this person, and then I may get a grant from this person, you know, and they this total will have to income.
Yeah,
Yes.
we kind of look to the funder to give us parameters for that. In this case, they didn't ask for it, so we didn't give it to them,
Right.
because that's just easier. They may say, you know, include budget and income, and then we would maybe say, you know, pending, you know, we have this confirmed, pending grants in XYZ amount. Sometimes they ask you to really spell it out, and they'll say, you know, we want a full accounting of everything you're applying for, everything that's outstanding, the names of those organizations, how much you asked for. So, you know, again, we kind of look to the funder to see, you know, what they're asking for, but they often, yeah, that is the question you will definitely get in grant applications is, you know, and you know, it can be to your benefit, because I think it can feel a little weird to write that in an application, like, okay, I'm also asking for money from these other people. But sometimes, you know, if you're able to say, hey, I've already gotten a grant or, you know, funding from this organization, it can give you leverage. They can say, oh, you know, the Brooklyn Community Foundation is already supporting this project. That's great. You know, if it was good enough for them, maybe it's good enough for us. But it's true, it can give you leverage. Any other questions?
I have a question. I looked at your proposal narrative as quickly as I could, and like, this is a museum of modern art. It's something very established. What you're looking for money for is something in existence. And I was wondering if you could give us maybe some suggestions, like for things that are, you know, some analogous, what should be in our proposal narratives, like what components should be in there, because we're not the museum of modern art. You know what I mean?
So I actually struggle with whether or not I should show you guys like
I'm not
one of
criticizing, I'm just
no,
trying
no,
to
no,
find
no.
like the equivalent of
Yeah.
what we should know. Like.
Because it's really up to what the application is.
Yeah.
It's, you know, there's no such thing as a typical grant application. So they could ask you for a one-page letter, or they could ask you for a gigantic application.
But okay, say in the case of two things like for my own purpose.
Yeah.
I have like a one-page, for example, that
Mhm.
describes this film I've written that's a narrative fictional film.
Mhm.
And then I'm like trying to raise money for a documentary, you know, like, you know, what components should be in a proposal narrative if you're doing those two kinds of projects? Like just roughly, I mean, I know you can't. Like,
Yeah, I think we'll get into that actually.
Okay, all right.
You get into kind of the approach, and if I haven't answered your question at the end, we can come back to it. So, let's talk about approach. So, what are the essential questions that you should be getting at in any grant application? Whether or not they guide you through them very specifically, or whether or not they just ask for a one-page summary and expect to kind of see all of these things on the paper. And just so you guys know, I see a lot of you are taking notes. That's awesome, but I will also definitely make this PowerPoint available to everyone afterwards as well. So, the sort of essential questions you want to ask are the following. So, what are you going to do, and how are you going to do it? Pretty basic. Why will your approach be effective? So, what about, you know, your qualifications or the way in which you're organizing this be effective? What are your deliverables? So what's the outcome here? Are you going to create a documentary? Is it just a script right now? You know, you have to be specific about sort of what the project outcomes are. And what are the timelines? So again, for that proposal for the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, we said we want funding for 2014 to 2015. We'll spend what you're going to give us in that timeline, because that's the timeline of the project. A year of support for film preservation. And then how will you evaluate or track your success? And this is where I think, especially with creative projects, people get tied up a little bit. And I will be the first to admit that when I'm doing something like an educational program or something that is just easier to kind of, like a performance, easier to track sort of what the outcome is. But it's definitely possible with creative projects as well. The sort of acronym that, you know, I think about is SMART, which is, you know, scientific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time. So, you know, when you're talking about how you're going to evaluate your project, you know, yes, I think there's room to say, you know, critical, you know, evaluations and like what does success mean? It's hard to, especially for a creative project, it's really hard to kind of get your head around it sometimes. But these are sort of ways you can think about it. So we had, you know, a sold out screening. Great. How many people was it? What was the size of the venue? You know, it played 5 times over these 5 weeks. Think about ways to kind of categorize, you know, different mentions in the press, or, you know, you want to try to drill down into specifics as much as possible when you're talking about outcomes, even with creative projects. So I think these are kind of a lot of the questions that, whether or not there's direction to specifically answer them, a lot of funders are looking for to be answered. So when you're writing a grant, it's really important to keep a style in mind for grant writing. You want to be as clear and concise as possible, especially with technical language. This is something that I deal with a lot with, especially with film preservation and conservation at MoMA, when they're talking about sort of technical processes. You can assume that, you know, I usually assume the reader has some basic level of knowledge. So when I'm mentioning Picasso, I don't say Spanish artist Pablo Picasso, you know, blah, blah, blah. I can just say Picasso, but if I'm talking about an XRF scanner in our conservation lab, that's when I'll pause and say an XRF scanner, comma, which is XYZ, comma, whatever, go on. So you can assume a basic level of knowledge on the subject, but don't assume that they are experts in what you're reading, even if it's, you know, a film, you know, a panelist of filmmakers, or, you know, it could very well be, you know, a board member who's vetting these proposals, an administrative assistant who's vetting these proposals. You really don't want to assume more than sort of a basic working level of knowledge about what you're talking about. So there's like one thing that I struggle with constantly when I work with different staff at MoMA. It's asking them to spell it out. So they will throw conference title names at me that are acronyms, acronyms for different pieces of technical equipment. They'll say, oh, I'm collaborating with so-and-so. I'm like, great, who is this person? So you know, spell it out, you know, names, titles, dates, locations. These are the kind of details, and I'll take you guys through some examples that a funder is going to be looking to see. You're not going to want them to, you know, they're not going to be they don't want to like have to be Googling things to figure out what you're talking about. And again, write for the informed generalist. So assume that they know what a documentary film is and maybe, you know, what some basic components are. But again, you know, I think it's always better to kind of have an aside to explain what something is. So this is really important. I think you want to be confident and firm in your commitment to the project. You want to project, and you want to be at a point truly in real life where this project is actually happening if you're at a point where you're applying for funding for it. But at the same time, you don't want to sound boastful, like, oh my gosh, this is going to be the best film ever. This is just, it's going to transform filmmaking as we know it. And you also don't want to sound desperate, you know. I've been working on this film for years, and I just can't find funding for it, and you know, you want to kind of strike that balance of being firm and confident. This film is happening. I'm fully committed to this project. My partners are fully committed to this project. But again, you don't want to sort of sway into either sounding like it's, you know, going to be this life-changing project, you know, overtly, or again, to sound desperate or too needy for funding. And then, you know, I think something that people kind of overlook is to show appreciation. You know, if you're applying for a grant, even if you don't get funding, people are going to be spending, you know, time reading through this thing. So, you know, that's why we always say respectfully request, thank them in your cover letter, thank them at the end, you know, for reviewing your project proposal. As much time as it takes you to write it, it will also take someone quite a bit of time to review it. So you always just want to be kind of strike a style and a note that's very respectful, professional, and I think, as we say in my office too sometimes, a lot of fundraising is just being polite. Please, thank you, being clear, being direct. People appreciate it.